Hi everyone, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me. So, a question for you. Does silicone, just applied to the palette knife and you swipe over, create cells and lacing? So that's my experiment today, and I'm going to use a colour palette that I've not really used much before. I've just done a creation with it and I've got some left over, so I thought, what best way to use the paints up with an experiment to see if what I think might happen happens. So today is experiment day. I'm going to puddle some paints on the canvas. I'll show you the colour palette and the canvas shortly. And then I'm literally just going to take my palette knife, put some drops of silicone on the palette knife and swipe over the surface where the paint is. I don't know if it's going to work, but that's what an experiment's about, isn't it? Seeing what reacts with what. So I'm excited. Thank you so much for being here. Let's see what we can create. So here's my colour palette. I have just used this for a creation. So I've got a deep green, got a red, I've got a grey, yellow ochre, and a rose quartz. So I'm going to use up those paints and I'm going to puddle them on this canvas. It's just a standard canvas. And then I'm going to use silicone. The silicone I'm using today is from De La Rowney System 3 Acrylic Silicone Oil. And I'm just going to use my palette knife and I'm going to place the silicone oil on the palette knife and swipe over the top just to see what reaction it has instead of actually mixing it in with those paints. So I'm ready. Let's go. So I always think it's good to do some experiments, and especially when I need to use up some paints so they don't go to waste. This is experiment time. So I'm just taking one colour at a time and I'm puddling those paints on the canvas. And I have sped up the video. I don't want you to get bored, but I do want you to see the full process that I go through. So just to recap, I'm using the paints. The paints are just mixed with water, 1 part paint to 1 part water, and I'm puddling them one colour at a time on the canvas. I'm now going to take my torch, it's a butane torch, and I'm just going to pop any air bubbles. I'm then going to take my palette knife and then I'm going to use the silicone oil and just drip some silicone oil on the palette knife. Its consistency is quite thick, so I'm just going to use my finger to spread out that oil across that full palette knife. And then I'm going to do some swiping. So I place the palette knife on the top of those puddles. I don't press down too much, just allow it to glide across the paint and swipe across that paint. So I'm going to do another swipe, so I'm just cleaning my palette knife off. I'm adding a little bit more silicone oil. As I say, it's fairly thick, so I'm just using my finger to spread it out. And then I'm going to swipe again across the canvas. I'm just going to use my torch again to pop any air bubbles and to also encourage that cell reaction. So it's now time to cover the canvas fully. So I pick up my canvas and I'm going to tilt from side to side and just spread that paint across the full surface area of the canvas itself. So I'm just using my torch just to encourage any reaction with that silicone oil with the paint. There's not much reaction, if I'm honest, so I've opted to use a more fluid silicone because I think the problem was the thickness of the silicone that I originally used. So I'm going to add some silicone oil to the palette knife and I'm just going to swipe across the canvas and I can already see cells forming. And I think that's down to the fluidity of the silicone oil that I used. The first oil was fairly thick, but this oil is very runny. And I think it was that runny consistency that I needed to help encourage those cells to form using that silicone oil. Okay, so lesson learned here is the more fluid lubricant, the more fluid silicone worked better than this one for this experiment, but it's this one that I normally use when I mix it into the paint. So to swipe over, I'd say we'd need to use more of a fluid silicone. This was the effect. It did take several swipes, but that's okay. You can see there the effect that had. I will let this dry. This is just a test piece, just so I can maybe think about using this technique and this method in future creations. But I think you can see the details here. All those cells that have been created with just the silicone. So they actually, all those colours look really nice together. I really like that kind of effect where I've swiped from one side to the other. I do like all that detail. So yeah, I'm going to let this dry. I'll let you see what it looks like once it's dry, and I'll go through what I've learned. So I'm just going to add to this experiment. I've still got some paints, so I'm going to use the remainder of my paints, place them in a cup, and I'm just going to add 2 drops of that very fluid silicone oil in, just to see what kind of reaction that has in contrast to the one that we've just done. So I'm placing all my paints in a cup. I've added 2 drops of silicone oil. I'll use all the rest of the paints up, and then I'm literally going to pour the cup of paint across the canvas and then tilt the canvas out so the paint covers that full surface area. So here we go. I'm just going to use the torch, not just to pop air bubbles, but this is to help encourage that cell reaction with the silicone oil and the paint. And I can see cells popping up as I use my torch. And it's really interesting to see that the silicone oil that I used here, that more fluid one, mixed within those paints, have created larger cells, but kind of clusters of cells rather than the cells that I've experienced in the one that I swiped with. So this one has kind of clusters of cells which are larger, and then the other canvas that we did previously where I swiped have more delicate smaller cells. So that's really interesting to do that experiment, just kind of change it up a little bit to add more to that experiment that we've done today. But I've got to admit, I really do love this effect. I love that swipe. But something to really consider when doing that swiping is you don't want to muddy your paints up. So I did have to swipe quite a lot, but luckily the colours that I've used have held their own vibrancy. So this one is probably my favourite compared to the other one. Okay, so a quick recap. So this was the smaller canvas that I did where I swiped the silicone oil over. And what I learned with this one is the type of silicone oil that I used, the more fluid one, worked so much better than this one. And then I, just as a bit of a contrast, I put the paint in a cup, added a couple of drops of silicone and just poured the cup out, and it created cells like this. So you can see the difference between the two. You get more kind of delicate cells as you would with a swipe compared to the larger cells that you just get with the pour from a cup. So it was just a little bit of an experiment to see if silicone oil added to the palette knife and swiped over would create some cells, and the answer was yes, it does, but I needed the silicone to be a little bit more fluid than the original silicone oil that I used. So lesson learned there, and these kind of experiments are really, really valuable. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you've had fun. I know I've had so much fun as well, and I really hope I get to see you again in the next video. And remember, whatever you're up to creatively, I hope you're having a good time with it. See you soon, everyone. Bye.